Imagine a world where Ridley Scott actually cared about history. A world where we could all sit down, eat some popcorn, and watch the latest sword and sandal epic, not just to be entertained, but also to learn a thing or two about the past. Unfortunately, that world remains as fictional as every single period piece that Scott has ever directed.
There's 400 books being written about Napoleon Bonaparte. 400. There's 2,500 books written about him. One book for every week since his death. Can you believe it? You've got 10,400 books to start. There's one book written every week since he died. By the time you get book 1,000, dude, I think it's got to be a lot of speculation.
So all these historians that have piled on you saying, you know, Mary Antoinette's hair wasn't that long,
I'm not going to walk into that death.
No.
Are you kidding me?
How much of the film is, what in your terms, accurate?
Of the 2 hours, 38 minutes, I'd say 38 minutes.
That, I think, just about sums it up. But what if I told you that there was once a director who could bridge the gap between Hollywood and history? And what if I told you that this very director, for all his passions, curiosities, and film projects, had always wanted to make one picture in particular, a picture about Napoleon? I'm talking about Stanley Kubrick, and thanks to this bad boy right here, you and I are going to learn all about his ill-fated Napoleon project, perhaps the greatest what-if in movie history. First, however, I'd like to ask you a question. Are you the next Stanley Kubrick? If so, consider enrolling with the sponsor of today's video, Southern New Hampshire University. SNHU is famous nationwide for its accredited online degree options, and it was voted as one of the country's most innovative universities. Perhaps like Kubrick, you want to get your start with photography, in which case you can consider SNHU's bachelor program in digital photography. Or maybe you're a writer, the type to collaborate with Kubrick on a screenplay. If so, you have quite a few options. You can get an MA or BA in creative writing in English, and even take highly tailored screenwriting courses. And did I mention that SNHU is radically affordable? Their online tuition rates are some of the lowest in the nation, and when you graduate, SNHU will be there to help you begin your job hunt. You also might be eligible for financial aid or have previous college credits that could fast-track your degree at SNHU. If any of that sounds interesting, check out my link in the description and pinned comment. snhu.edu/empirebuilders, one word. And with that said, let's get back to the video. The year is 1967, and Kubrick is riding high. After 3 or so years in production, 2001: A Space Odyssey, his most ambitious project yet, is set to hit theaters the following spring. I've got MGM eating out of the palm of my hand, he tells assistant director Andrew Birkin. This is my chance to make the one film I've always wanted to make. By May of '68, Birkin is in Paris with a 2-man film crew, dodging past rioters and casing Napoleonic landmarks. Wherever Napoleon went, I want you to go, Kubrick had told him, and if you find a few trinkets, buy them up. With these instructions and a letter from the Ministry of Culture, Birkin got inside access to Versailles and Les Invalides. At Versailles, he saw Napoleon's lavatory and Josephine's bath. At Les Invalides, the Emperor's ring, which got stuck on Birkin's finger, as well as the Imperial field chair, which snapped under his camera assistant's weight. Birkin eventually returned to Kubrick with soil samples from Waterloo, and he also brought a bronze replica of Napoleon's death mask. After receiving the mask on Christmas Day, Kubrick looked at it, Birkin recalled, with what seemed a sense of foreboding, probably because he'd already heard what was happening at MGM. Kubrick had spent the better part of that year preparing to make this film, approaching the subject matter the same way Napoleon approached a military campaign. More than anything else, Kubrick wanted to give us, his audience, the feeling of what it was like to be with Napoleon. And toward that end, he read hundreds of books, watched just as many films, consulted with historians, and even compiled a day-to-day account of Napoleon's life with a team of Oxford graduates. By November of '68, Kubrick was something of a Napoleonic expert himself, having read almost everything available on the man in English, and having watched virtually every film that touched on the Napoleonic. The amount of material he amassed with his team of researchers, photographers, production designers, and art directors was, in a word, prodigious. We're talking about a library of 500 volumes, each of them cataloged and indexed, and also a picture file of 17,000 photographs, with everything from paintings to sculptures to engravings to etchings meticulously mounted on IBM punch cards. 3 months' worth of costume sketches had also been compiled by ballet and opera designer David Walker, who just about reached his artistic limits after one too many, let us say for the sake of monetization, Schnitzlerian commissions. What this amounted to was dozens and dozens of binders, boxes, and filing cabinets dedicated to Napoleon, and that's to say nothing about the many notebooks filled with Stanley's meditations about the topic. It's safe to say that this was the world's biggest privately owned Napoleonic archive, and intellectually speaking, this was a level of preparation unmatched by any film, except perhaps the Lord of the Rings trilogy. As knowledgeable as Kubrick was, though, he did of course consult with historians. For military details, he turned to David Chandler, and for general queries to Felix Markham. Having secured the rights to Markham's biography, Kubrick peppered him with questions day in, day out, the way Napoleon habitually did with his staff. On at least 2 occasions, Kubrick and Markham sat down and recorded their conversations, the transcripts making it abundantly clear that the director had done his homework. Often his highly specific questions stumped even this world-renowned historian, and more than once in their conversations, Markham simply had to promise to get back to him. All the while, logistics were never far from Kubrick's mind, this being another of his Napoleonic qualities. The director gave a great deal of thought to dealing with the, in his words, 4 principal categories of cost of any spectacle film, namely, the large number of extras, uniforms, sets, and A-listers that would, if not carefully managed, kill his brainchild in the cradle. For a movie such as this, there was no getting around hiring a bunch of extras. The Russians had used tens of thousands during their production of War and Peace, and Kubrick was not about to be outdone. Even more than that, though, he was determined to use the art of cinema to do justice to the Emperor's art of war. Napoleonic battles are so beautiful, the otherwise anti-war Kubrick opined, like vast lethal ballets. It's rather like watching 2 golden eagles soaring through the sky from a distance. They may be tearing a dove to pieces, but if you are far enough away, the scene is beautiful. Okay, so 30 to 40,000 extras it is. But where from, Stanley? Taking a page from War and Peace, which had rented out the Red Army, Kubrick decided on renting out the National Forces of Romania. The daily cost would be $2 per man, a steal when you consider that a French costume extra would have set him back $24.30. At $5 per man, then unbalkanized Yugoslavia was the obvious second choice. As regards costume manufacturing, both Romania and Yugoslavia offered $40 per uniform, about a fifth of the price compared to Western Europe. Here, though, Kubrick's resourcefulness yielded an even better deal. Working with a New York-based outfit, he got the price all the way down to $1 to $4 per uniform. Cheaper and lower quality to be sure, but just fine at a distance based on the camera tests he already conducted. Meanwhile, the palatial sets he needed to build would have set him back $3 to $6 million, a princely sum he intended to avoid altogether by shooting on location in France and Italy. Not only would this make interior shots more authentic, renting these spaces only cost about $550 per day, with minimal set design necessary. Kubrick also planned on using the front projection methodology developed for the Dawn of Man segment in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Later, he'd make the same proposal for Barry Lyndon, only to end up shooting on location for that film as well. This came with challenges of its own, lighting being one of them. But already for Napoleon, Kubrick was planning to shoot in 100% natural lighting, hoping to make candlelit scenes viable with an f/0.9 Zeiss lens developed for NASA. Lastly, as regards casting, Kubrick planned to go without A-listers where possible, preferring story and spectacle to stars. Citing the findings of a variety study, he argued the ROI on name recognition was dubious at best. That being said, he did have a few big names in mind for the main cast, namely Audrey Hepburn for Josephine, as well as David Hemming and Ian Holm for Napoleon. Eventually, it was none other than Jack Nicholson who became Kubrick's first choice, Nicholson having earned his chops in smaller roles without becoming too famous. This put him right in the sweet spot for a director like Stanley, who knew talent when he saw it, had a clear vision for his film, and wanted nothing like the experience he had filming Spartacus. At the same time, Kubrick wanted somebody magnetic. "I want an actor of between 30 to 35 who has the good looks of the younger Napoleon. He should be able to convey the restless energy, the ruthlessness, and the inflexible will of Bonaparte, but at the same time, the tremendous charm which every contemporary memoirist attributes to him." He also wanted a Josephine who was beautiful and elegant, but who was, true to history, 5 or 6 years older than Napoleon. Kubrick knew that this unrequited love story was one of the greatest in history, but unlike Scott, he did not want to limit his film to just that aspect. Inside the front flap of a book called Napoleon and Josephine, Kubrick makes his final verdict on Napoleon clear. "I don't claim he is the best and most honorable man in history, only the most interesting." Perhaps that is why Kubrick persisted with the project so long, even as it became less and less likely that it would ever get made. Already in July of '68, news about Kubrick's Napoleon had broken. Sure enough, it was MGM that agreed to foot the bill, a real coup for Stanley given the studio's mounting losses. The plan was to make a 3-hour-long cinematic epic, and though the screenplay wasn't done, a film treatment had been prepared with 15 12-minute sequences. Shooting was supposed to last 150 days beginning on the 1st of July, 1969. For a film as grand as this one, it was an awfully tight schedule, allowing only 30 days for battles and marches, 80 days for location exteriors, 30 days for front projection, and 10 days for travel. But by the time Kubrick turned in his production notes on the 22nd of November, 1968, MGM's embattled president, Robert O'Brien, was fighting to maintain control. By January of the following year, O'Brien had been replaced by a serial industry executive, and Kubrick was without a research team. Nonetheless, he resolved to finish the screenplay on his own. As he was doing this, though, the film industry suddenly became saturated with little Napoleons. There was Eli Wallach in The Adventures of Gerard, Kenneth Haig in Eagle in a Cage, and of course Rod Steiger in Waterloo. For his part, Kubrick was unimpressed. Thanks to Birkin, he received an advanced copy of Waterloo's screenplay, and after seeing it on screen, he described it as a silly film in a letter to Felix Markham, betraying more than a hint of resentment. At this point, Kubrick should have been cheering these movies on, as the fact that none of them made money only served as the nail in the coffin for his project. What followed next was A Clockwork Orange, and it was during this cinematic side quest that Kubrick became acquainted with Anthony Burgess. This was the novelist behind A Clockwork Orange, and while working with Kubrick on the film, Burgess toyed with the idea of writing something on Napoleon. In the close of '71, he presented Kubrick with a manuscript copy of the Napoleon Symphony, a story of the emperor in 4 movements. His Napoleon was an overworked, oversexed, overreaching bureaucrat, not all that different from what Kubrick had in mind, but ultimately of little use to him for a film treatment. Not to mention, MGM had just recently announced its pivot toward TV, and so by 1972, Kubrick found a new home at Warner Brothers and pursued a different project. This would end up being Barry Lyndon, one of the most beautiful and sumptuous films, not just in the period genre, but in all of cinema. As many others have observed before me, this is a movie where every frame, indoors or outdoors, looks and feels like a painting, so much so that the whole experience can best be likened to strolling through an art gallery. Besides establishing Kubrick as master of the period genre, Barry Lyndon was, in many ways, a tribute to the stillborn Napoleon. Everything from the use of natural lighting, to the on-location shooting, to the period, to the characters, to the plot, all of it was redolent of the Napoleonic project. Based on a Thackeray novel and set around the time of the 7 Years' War, the eponymous protagonist of the story is a little bit like the 18th century Forrest Gump, but he also has his parallels with another character. Quoting from Kubrick biographer John Baxter, Barry resents the fact that over the previous century, the English have bought, won, or stolen most of Ireland, including his own ancestral estate. A born gambler, he bets his life and fortune, but is cheated, seduced, misled, and finally destroyed by the shrewder, more ruthless English and Prussians. Now, who does that remind you of? If you guessed Napoleon, then congratulations, you know your history. Like Barry, Napoleon was an islander, born in Corsica around the time the French were taking it over. He too was a gambler, perhaps the greatest in history, and he was eventually outdone by the English and Prussians at Waterloo. Despite all that, when Barry Lyndon came out in '75, it wasn't exactly a box office hit. With a budget of $11 million, it grossed not quite 3 times that. Nonetheless, Kubrick still clung to the hope of making his Napoleon film, estimating it would cost between $50 to $60 million. Unfortunately for him, the memory of Waterloo, not the battle but the movie, still haunted studio executives from west to east. Having cost $25 million to make, it had earned only $1.4 million, making the ROI on a Napoleon project a dubious prospect even in the hands of Stanley Kubrick. By 1980, the project was as good as dead, and even Kubrick went on record as saying that he hadn't thought about the prospect in years. Oh yeah, what about a screenplay though? Clocking in at 186 pages and completed by the man himself on the 29th of September 1969, I certainly enjoyed going through it. But I have to confess that I found his film treatment far more interesting. Based on the treatment, it's clear that Kubrick knew Napoleon's story inside and out. But the screenplay is uneven, rushed at times, especially towards the end. At the end of the day, though, this is a director who was, for all his many plans and preparations, notorious for changing a screenplay last minute. That is why I am positive that the final project would have been spectacular. Partly that's just because of the subject matter, which has enough twists and turns to make even the most audacious novelist blush. As regards this subject matter, that is to say Napoleon's life, Kubrick probably put it best. It has everything a good story should have. A towering hero, powerful enemies, armed combat, a tragic love story, loyal and treacherous friends, and plenty of bravery, cruelty, and sex. That is why I, for one, am cautiously optimistic about any future Napoleon projects, especially since the next one may or may not involve some of the most talented people in the industry. Not only that, it seems their stated intention is to reprise the work of Stanley Kubrick, adapting his screenplay into a 7-part limited series. However, for all the material he accumulated, it should be noted that Kubrick was only working with 2/3 of the puzzle. Quoting from historian Andrew Roberts, "More books have been written with Napoleon in the title than there have been days since his death in 1821. Every one of them published since 1857 relied upon the correspondence that Napoleon III published as a tribute to his uncle. However," Roberts goes on, "in one of the great publishing endeavors of the 21st century, the Napoleon Foundation in Paris has since 2004 been publishing every one of the more than 33,000 letters that Napoleon signed. The culmination of this immense project demands nothing less than a complete reevaluation of this extraordinary man. It will therefore not suffice to merely adapt Kubrick's material. What we really need is someone to build on it."